Trump is back, but should stakeholders operating within the intersecting CPG categories of functional foods, functional beverages, and nutritional supplements be cheerful about his return to the Oval Office? And if that introduction sounded super familiar, again, it's because this would be the third of what will initially include 4 parts of my Trump 2.0 content miniseries. If you didn't catch either of the previous 2 parts loosely titled Regulatory and Global Trade yet, I'd suggest stopping this content right now and consuming those first because they do have some valuable chronological elements. But for my regular audience that has already consumed the previous regulatory and global trade parts of my Trump 2.0 content miniseries, unless you want another refresh of my second Trump presidential term general strategy considerations, you could save a few minutes by skipping ahead to the next chapter of this video. And by saying that, I promise to again do my best to remember adding content chapters. But if I do forget on this one, you'll easily be able to recognize the skippable repeat section because I'm wearing a different outfit. So this will certainly not sound like a hot take or anything, but the second Trump presidential term will undoubtedly offer a mixture of risk and reward, ushering in a new era of market volatility. As Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt recently pointed out, we once again have access to the most transparent and accessible president in American history. There has never been a president who communicates with the American people as openly and authentically as Donald Trump. But while I personally enjoy that operating model, it does create an economic environment that I recently described to an industry colleague as best suited for master sailors. And that's because the art of both the sailor and business person is to leave nothing to chance. But sailors are artists whose medium is the wind, and today's business people must be artists whose medium is correctly spotting Donald Trump's subtle hints that reveal upcoming events. Furthermore, I believe a key to potentially benefiting from the Trump 2.0 driver demand requires understanding how to position against a few of his known but converging the art of the deal tendencies. And these would be 1, a little hyperbole never hurts; 2, confirm an impression they were already predisposed to believe; 3rd, never get too attached to one deal or one approach; and then 4thly, sometimes your best decisions are the ones that you don't make. Finally, it's extremely important to consider rate of speed and level of efficiency surrounding Trump 2.0 changes. Since this is a been there, done that kind of thing, Trump won't fumble through the initial phase of his term trying to reconcile his frustrations towards the differences between global business and government. Trump will have a better understanding around bottlenecks and getting around choke points, including how to flex unilateral powers. Also, given that the House and Senate are Republican majorities, at least for the next 2 years, that political trifecta usually creates efficiency and makes for stickier policy changes. But the inspiration behind my latest first principles thinking content piece, or I guess content miniseries, was a Trump 2.0 section titled Rhetoric, Foreshadowing, Action is Greater Than Embellished Negotiation Tactics that I included into many of the functional CPG brand and supply side client presentations during the last quarter of 2024. And while each of those client presentations were packed with diverse, personalized insights, I'm confident this Trump 2.0 content miniseries, filled with a refined and expanded version of my generalized base case strategies, will be extremely valuable to my regular audience. So just to kind of set the stage, you can expect this Trump 2.0 content miniseries to initially include 4 loosely titled parts: regulatory, global trade, financial, and commerce. But let's get started, and I figured part 3 of this Trump 2.0 content miniseries should be financial because he loves to use especially the stock market as measurement for his success and economic scoreboard overall. Also, actions that could affect the various financial markets and financial instruments could be considered the yin to the yang of the last Trump 2.0 content miniseries part that focused on global trade. And that's because over the past maybe half century, global flows of trade and investment have accelerated dramatically and in the process created enormous economic value. But while going backwards and erecting massive trade barriers won't move us forward by creating lasting growth and shared prosperity, it doesn't mean we should keep doing the same old things. Instead, the United States needs to move forward based on a new economic agenda. But maybe that's a good transition to initially save the categorically relevant stock market talk until later and begin with possible America First actions, because as Trump recently stated, every policy must be geared towards that which supports the American worker, the American family, and businesses, both large and small, and allows our country to compete with other nations on a very level playing field. And I group the expected Trump 2.0 policy decisions to restore and promote American competitiveness into three buckets: cutting burdensome regulations, retaliatory tariffs, and providing financial incentives. And while I deeply covered the first two policy decision buckets within the previous Trump 2.0 content miniseries parts, I will weave in a few more pertinent details throughout this financial part. So that leaves us with examining possibilities around the financial incentives policy decision bucket that seeks to restore and promote American competitiveness. And with vowing to reduce deficit spending and debt levels, the Trump 2.0 expansionary fiscal policy lever of choice will be tax cuts. But while the biggest Trump 2.0 tax priority of making expiring individual 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions permanent is obviously beneficial to functional CPG industry stakeholders, I want to focus on a collection of relevant potential new business tax law changes and business tax provisions from that expiring Trump 1.0 policy. And I'll start with maybe the most intriguing America First business tax law proposal would be a reduction in the corporate tax rate for companies that manufacture within the United States. But while details around made in the USA corporate tax rate reductions are slim right now, it could create a lot of gray area for stakeholders operating within the intersecting CPG categories of functional foods, functional beverages, and nutritional supplements. And that's because while most inputs from raw materials to ingredients aren't readily available presently from domestic sources, the actual finished goods manufacturing, especially for products sold within the United States market, is typically completed domestically. From a marketing and or product labeling perspective, the FTC specifies when a company can truly claim made in the USA, but I deem the knowledge of those requirements and marketplace compliance to be relatively low currently. And then let's call it an adjacent America First business tax law proposal would be repealing the corporate alternative minimum tax, which was enacted as part of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. But since the intersecting functional CPG categories don't possess many of these yet, eliminating the 15% minimum tax on large corporations with annual income exceeding $1 billion would only be potentially beneficial to a few dozen stakeholders anyways. So switching to America First business tax law changes that are more broadly impactful, Trump 1.0 restorations of immediate expensing of research and development costs and 100% bonus depreciation have been thrown around as possibilities. Additionally, Trump 2.0 tax policies could include expansion of allowable expenses around manufacturing investments. But while expansion of domestic manufacturing tax deductions is a possibility, I wouldn't necessarily be hopeful for a piece of legislation like the CHIPS Act of 2022, providing functional CPG industry stakeholders with massive levels of funding and tax incentives. And that's because while the functional CPG industry does have an excess dependency on imports, I wouldn't consider it top of mind for a United States manufacturing renaissance, even with the Make America Healthy Again focus. If anything, I'd echo my previous global trade part commentary that maybe certain nutrients that aren't just functional CPG inputs, but also needed for domestic agricultural practices like B vitamins for chickens to support egg production could be considered a matter of national security and prioritized for larger domestic production financial incentives. Yet, I believe outside of cutting burdensome environmental and agricultural regulations and retaliatory tariffs to improve the global competitiveness, overcoming the excess dependency on imports within the intersecting functional CPG categories will need to come largely from private financial markets. But as I mentioned at the end of the Trump 2.0 content miniseries portion, loosely dubbed Global Trade, building U.S. production involves major capital expenditures, and setup around growing new agricultural products can be insanely expensive. And the probability that both large-scale supply chain diversification and transformation efforts are supported by private financial markets is closely tied to interest rate dynamics. So if Trump 2.0 global trade policies initially drive consumer prices higher, thus necessitating tighter monetary policy with the Federal Reserve, potentially keeping interest rates higher for longer, moonshot transformative ag tech and food tech startups would unfortunately face a super tough fundraising environment, but really that would unfortunately impact the entire CPG startup landscape overall. But maybe the last financial instrument that the second Trump administration hopes to influence is the strength of the US dollar. During his first term, the US dollar fell about 10% against a basket of currencies, but Trump 1.0 also featured a 2-year period that saw the US dollar gain about 15%. For those not familiar with the reasoning around devaluing the US dollar, Trump wants to increase exports to mainly close the trade deficit and associated loss of manufacturing market share. Additionally, Trump economic advisors likely realize that companies that export have higher productivity growth and wider participation in investment opportunities. Now, most of this is outside the direct control of any functional CPG stakeholder, but Trump wanting a weaker dollar would hurt hard to repatriate supply chains like ours by making imported raw materials and ingredients more expensive. But that potential currency-related impact also isn't clear-cut to predict in today's globalization world, as China allowed its own currency to slide during the first Trump administration to offset US actions. In a perfectly competitive academic textbook world, exchange rates adjust based on the ratio of respective consumer price levels, which is called law of one price. But in the real world, that overlooks the complex mechanisms behind exchange rate fluctuations like inflation expectations, costs of carry, also known as relative interest rates, local politics, capital market risks, and in the US dollar's case, its reserve status. And that probably takes us back to the comment that started off this Trump 2.0 content miniseries part, that Trump loves to use especially the stock market as measurement for his success and economic scoreboard overall. With its relatively strong growth, reserve currency status, outperforming stock market, and technological leadership, the United States is relatively viewed positively by investors. So if Trump wants to achieve the difficult task of causing the US dollar to fall significantly for an extended period, it will require, oddly enough, him convincing the world that America isn't great. Moreover, the stock market has performed twice as well during US dollar bull markets than US dollar bear markets since 1980. And intentionally creating long-term stock market growth resistance based on Trump solely believing the US trade deficit is the only reflection of its competitiveness doesn't seem aligned with how he has previously approached economic policies. So I'd expect the stock market to remain resilient, especially if Trump 2.0 continues to adopt a transactional approach to tariffs rather than escalating into a harsh global trade war. Does that mean we should expect the S&P 500 benchmark to rise almost 70% over the Trump term again? While it wouldn't necessarily be a statistical anomaly, collective Trump 2.0 bullishness surrounds aspects like the previously mentioned tax cuts, relatively more supportive debt capital markets, and higher macroeconomic visibility. But also due to expected reduction in power of US financial regulators and increased M&A activity due to reduced regulation. The good news for certain functional CPG industry stakeholders is that the expected reduction in power of US financial regulators could be positive for micro and small cap companies below $2 billion in market capitalization that will have lower costs of complying with regulatory requirements. Additionally, by lowering these costs, it could slightly increase the attractiveness of certain liquidity events. Alternatively, the expectation for increased M&A activity due to reduced regulation has been diminished, at least currently, after new FTC chairman Andrew Ferguson said they would keep using the stricter guidelines adopted by the administration of former president to review proposed corporate mergers. The reasoning given, and why I believe it could be changed later, was that Ferguson believes stability is good for the enforcement agencies, with extensive reworking of guidelines being both time-consuming and expensive. And maybe that's a good transition into mentioning the last aspect within this Trump 2.0 content miniseries part, loosely titled financial. While briefly mentioned in the previous parts, the Department of Government Efficiency, aka DOGE, was established to reduce wasteful, fraudulent, and abusive federal spending by primarily modernizing federal technology and software to maximize governmental efficiency and productivity. And whether you are in the 28% of US registered voters that doesn't support the existence of a federal agency focused on efficiency, or you simply dislike the way DOGE is getting the public to pay attention, it doesn't matter, because Trump and DOGE DOGE, led by Elon Musk, are indeed objectively correct that America is drowning in deficits, and some is from spending on downright silly programs. But that being said, we can also agree on the bulk of the deficit and annual budget stems from the US government consisting of a military attached to an insurance company. So the only way to truly reduce the deficit is to target the very programs that pretty much every president refuses to touch: defense, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So will Elon Musk be able to solve the greatest puzzle of all time? I wouldn't bet against a guy that has shown an impressive ability to break down complex problems into their most basic elements and build solutions from the ground up. In the process of building the government US citizens deserve, bureaucracy will undoubtedly do as it always does, pushing back on everything. And jobs will certainly be lost, like the 700 FDA employees that were recently impacted by cuts. But I believe we must embrace change if the alternative is disaster. But then finally, more details on how those job losses, along with other consumer spending insights, could impact the strategic decisions of stakeholders operating within the intersecting CPG categories of functional foods, functional beverages, and nutritional supplements will be included within the next Trump 2.0 content miniseries, part loosely dubbed Commerce. But I hope you enjoyed the first principles thinking that went into my latest YouTube video. If you did, can you do me a favor by hitting that like button? That quick and free action helps YouTube know my content is worth spreading to more people. Also, we're getting really close to reaching my next subscriber goal, and it would be great if you join me on this journey. But to do that, we need to fix the fact that slightly more than 3/4 of you that are watching this video right now are not subscribed to my YouTube channel, and that hurts my feelings. Regardless, I want to thank you for giving me some of your attention and time, and I'll see you on the next one.